In 1983, a Soviet military officer sat alone in a bunker outside Moscow. Every screen in front of him was screaming. Alarms were blaring. His system was telling him that American nuclear missiles were inbound, one confirmed, then 4 more right behind it. He had one job: report it. His country's doctrine was clear: launch a counterstrike. He had minutes to decide. And here's the thing nobody talks about: he didn't trust the system. Something felt off. He couldn't prove it, not in any official way. Just a read on a situation that contradicted everything the data was screaming at him. So he made a call that had no precedent, no protocol backing it up, and no safety net if he was wrong. And you've probably never heard of him, which means either he was completely wrong and got lucky, or he was right, and everything that followed in your life happened because of one decision made in a Soviet bunker in the middle of the night. Stay with me, because that answer changes everything about how you... Here's what nobody tells you about pressure. Your brain doesn't just slow down under it, it physically changes. When you're stressed, your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for rational thinking, consequence evaluation, and impulse control, gets flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. The rational brain doesn't disappear, but it gets outcompeted. What takes over is the amygdala, ancient, fast, emotional. It's built to keep you alive in a jungle, not in a boardroom or a nuclear command center. And that matters because most of history's worst decisions weren't made by stupid people. They were made by intelligent people whose brains were chemically hijacked at the worst possible moment. Case in point: the 1986 Challenger disaster. The night before the launch, engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the solid rocket boosters, were making a direct case to NASA: do not launch. Overnight temperatures were dropping to as low as 8 degrees Fahrenheit at Cape Canaveral. The rubber O-rings that sealed the joints on the rocket boosters had never flown in conditions anywhere close to that cold. Roger Boisjoli, one of the lead engineers, had warned in a written memo 6 months earlier that a failure of these rings could result in his words, a catastrophe of the highest order, loss of human life. NASA pushed back hard. There was schedule pressure, budget pressure. The launch had already been delayed multiple times, and the mission carried enormous public weight. It was putting the first civilian into space, a schoolteacher named Krista McAuliffe, and millions of schoolchildren were watching. What happened next is documented in the Rogers Commission report. NASA asked Thiokol to reconsider. The burden of proof shifted. Thiokol management pulled the engineers off the call, held a private caucus, overruled their own team, and sent NASA a written recommendation to launch. It was the first time NASA had ever proceeded after receiving an explicit no-launch recommendation from a major contractor. 73 seconds after liftoff, Challenger broke apart. Now, what happened there wasn't stupidity. It was something sociologist Diane Vaughan, who spent years studying the disaster, calls normalization of deviance, the gradual process by which warning signs get accepted as normal, because nothing catastrophic has happened yet. The O-rings had shown damage on previous missions, but those missions didn't fail. So the risk got quietly absorbed into the definition of acceptable. Pressure accelerates that process. When people need a decision to go a certain way, they find reasons to justify it, often without realizing they're doing it at all. Now here's where it gets darker. You'd think the more experienced someone is, the better they'd handle pressure. The research suggests it's not that simple. There's a consistent pattern in studies of expert performance under stress, in aviation, surgery, and military command, where overconfidence built from prior success creates a blind spot. Experts stop checking assumptions they've already confirmed. They trust the pattern. And when the pattern is wrong, they're already committed. What this might suggest, based on what we understand about cognitive load and heuristic shortcuts, is that experience can narrow the field of options someone considers, helpful when the situation is familiar, dangerous when it isn't. Aviation has an informal name for this phenomenon: get there-itis. It's the unofficial term for when a pilot, usually an experienced one, becomes so locked onto completing a flight that they override their own warning signals. Weather deteriorating, fuel running low, visibility shrinking. They push on because they've done it before, because turning back feels like failure. It's contributed to numerous accidents across the history of commercial and private aviation. But there's something even more unsettling than individual overconfidence. What happens when pressure isn't personal, but collective? In April 1961, President John F. Kennedy authorized one of the most catastrophically planned military operations in American history, the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. The plan was inherited from the Eisenhower administration and had serious structural problems that multiple analysts had flagged. Yet in the room where Kennedy and his advisors deliberated, no one pressed hard enough to stop it. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was in those meetings, wrote afterward, "Had one senior advisor opposed the adventure, I believe that Kennedy would have canceled it. No one spoke against it." Yale psychologist Irving Janis spent years studying exactly this kind of failure. He named it groupthink, the phenomenon where a cohesive group, under pressure for consensus, suppresses individual doubt in favor of apparent unity. Nobody wants to be the one who disrupts the room. The social cost of dissent starts to feel higher than the strategic cost of the wrong decision. It's worth noting that some later scholars, including psychologist Roderick Kramer, have argued the Bay of Pigs failure was driven less by pure groupthink and more by political calculation, advisors optimizing for what they thought Kennedy wanted to hear, rather than what the military situation required. Either way, the result was the same. A room full of capable people, under pressure, converging on a decision none of them fully believed in. And here's why that matters for you. This doesn't only happen in government war rooms. Groupthink shows up in hospital wards, corporate strategy sessions, and friend groups. The pressure doesn't have to be existential to distort a room. It just has to be real. Let's go back to that Soviet bunker. The man's name was Stanislav Petrov. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, and critically, he had helped develop the software for the very early warning system he was now monitoring. On September 26, 1983, during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War, just 3 weeks after Soviet jets had shot down Korean Airlines Flight Nur 7, killing all 269 people aboard, the early warning system code named OCO reported one incoming nuclear missile from the United States. Then 4 more. The alerts were automatically relayed up the chain, but it was Petrov, as duty officer, who had to make the initial judgment call. Here's what he reasoned in the minutes he had. A U.S. first strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not 5. 5 missiles couldn't degrade the Soviet Union's ability to counterstrike. It didn't make military sense. On top of that, the system was new. Petrov knew it was prone to error, and the ground-based radar, which should have been picking up missiles rising above the horizon, showed nothing. So instead of reporting it up the chain, he waited. He declared it a false alarm to his own judgment and held his position. No missiles arrived. The cause was eventually traced to a rare alignment of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds in the Cosmos 1382 satellite's orbit, a blind spot in the system that was later corrected. Now, the Soviet government classified the incident. Far from receiving recognition, Petrov was reportedly reprimanded for faulty documentation during those critical minutes. The story didn't become public until after the Cold War ended. Later in life, he received the Dresden Peace Prize and other international honors, but for decades, the man sat in relative obscurity. He said afterward that he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like someone who made a decision and couldn't be sure, even at the time, that he was right. But here's what Petrov's story actually reveals about decision-making under pressure. He didn't overcome the alarm by ignoring it. He used a specific, identifiable mental move. He asked what doesn't fit. Rather than processing the alert at face value, he looked for the inconsistency. 5 missiles versus the hundreds that doctrine demanded. A brand new system with no real-world track record. 2 data points that didn't square with the conclusion being forced on him. Cognitive researcher Gary Klein, who spent decades studying how experts, firefighters, military commanders, ER physicians, make accurate calls under time pressure, found something similar in his fieldwork. The best decision-makers weren't running faster analytical processes. They were pattern matching against deeply internalized experience, instantly noticing when something was off. Klein called it the recognition prime decision model, and it suggests that what looks like intuition is often experience that's been so deeply absorbed it operates below conscious deliberation. What Petrov did, in other words, wasn't a lucky guess. It was the output of genuine expertise applied to exactly the right question. Here's the uncomfortable thread that runs through every story you've heard so far. Challenger, the Bay of Pigs, Petrov's bunker. They all share something. Not stupidity, not malice, not even bad luck. In each case, the cost of slowing down felt higher than the cost of being wrong. That's the real trap. Not the pressure itself, but the way pressure distorts time perception. Research in decision science, drawing on the foundational dual process work of Kahneman and Tversky and expanded by later scholars, consistently shows that time pressure shifts people from deliberate, analytical reasoning toward faster, more intuitive processing. That shift is often efficient, but it comes at a cost. It tends to deprioritize the very checks that catch errors. The brain starts cutting corners, and the corners it cuts first are the ones you'd most want it to keep. This is why emergency rooms have checklists, why commercial aircraft have pre-flight protocols even for captains with 20,000 hours logged, why nuclear launch procedures require 2 officers to simultaneously turn 2 separate keys, not because the individuals are incompetent, but because systems are built to compensate for what pressure reliably does to human judgment. Here's the twist, though. Not every fast decision is a bad one. Klein's research on fireground commanders found that in over 80% of decision points studied, experienced fire chiefs didn't compare multiple options at all. They recognized the situation as a type they'd encountered before, identified a course of action, and ran a quick mental simulation to see if it held up. When it did, they acted. This suggests that the quality of a fast decision depends almost entirely on the quality of the experience behind it. The decision isn't being made in the moment. It was, in a sense, already made through years of deliberate exposure to similar situations. Which raises an uncomfortable question about the engineers at Morton Thiokol. They had the knowledge. They had the data. They raised the alarm loudly and in writing. And they were overruled anyway. Sometimes the failure isn't in the individual decision maker at all. Sometimes the system fails first, and the individual is just the last line of a defense that's already So where does this leave you? Because here's the reality. You will make decisions under pressure. Maybe not ones that involve nuclear arsenals, but ones that matter. A job offer with a hard deadline. A relationship reaching a breaking point. A financial call. A moment where the pressure is real. Someone is waiting, and your cortisol is spiking. The research points to a few things that actually hold up. First, name the pressure explicitly. Studies by UCLA psychologist Matthew Lieberman and colleagues found that verbally labeling an emotional state, even something as simple as saying, "I feel pressured right now," measurably reduces activity in the amygdala. You're not suppressing the feeling. You're giving your prefrontal cortex a foothold back into the process. It works, and it works faster than most people expect. Second, categorize the decision before the pressure arrives if you can. Jeff Bezos has written about distinguishing one-way doors from two-way doors, irreversible decisions that deserve deep deliberation versus reversible ones that can be made quickly and corrected. The trap, he argues, is that under pressure, everything feels like a one-way door. Developing the habit of making that distinction before the alarm goes off is one of the highest value mental moves available. Third, find the inconsistency. Not, does this feel right? But what about this situation doesn't fit? Petrov's most important move wasn't trusting his gut. It was asking a sharper question than the situation was demanding. One uncomfortable data point, if you're willing to see it, is often the most honest voice in the room. None of this guarantees the right outcome. Roger Boisioli did everything right. He raised the alarm, documented his concerns, made the argument, and was overruled anyway. He spent years afterward dealing with PTSD and professional isolation for having been right. But what doesn't change, what you can actually control, is the quality of the question you ask in the seconds before you commit. Stanislav Petrov went home after that shift, didn't tell his wife what had happened, and went to sleep. She didn't find out for 10 years. He later said he wasn't sure, even now, whether he should consider himself a hero or just a man who made a judgment call and happened to be right. Maybe that's the most honest thing anyone has ever said about a decision made under pressure. The part that wasn't luck, the training, the experience, the one clear question asked when everything was screaming at him to just act, that part is worth sitting with. Because at some point, the alarm goes off for all of us. The question is what we've built to answer it.